Since becoming chairman in January, I've been trying to find a solution to the problem that we all acknowledge, which is a border out of control, laws being abused, humanitarian crisis, a national security crisis in the making. In March, the committee held a hearing to learn the scope of the problem. In Rio Grande area alone, the number of families have doubled. The problem is getting to be unmanageable. We're all concerned about the humanitarian conditions. That's why we supported a $4 billion appropriations to provide better housing, but we've done nothing to stop the flow until today. In May, I introduced a bill after finding the scope of the hearing that was based on the best advice I could get from those in charge. And Kevin McAleen, who testified in June, the DHS director, said that the bill we have before this committee would stop 70 to 90% of the flow. And my colleagues on the other side say, what about Central America? You're right, we need to invest in Central America, but there's not enough money to invest until we change the magnets. The problem is pretty obvious. You come to America, you ask for asylum, 80% of the claims are denied. The hearing is a year or 2 or 3 years away. People don't show up. You bring a small child. We can only hold them for 20 days. Anecdotally, 30% of the families are fraudulent families. The cartels, smugglers, and human traffickers are exploiting this, making billions of dollars a month. The flow is never ending, and if we don't do something to change our laws, it will never stop. So this bill changes our laws. It will allow us to have a timeout on asylum claims. They have to be made in the country through a refugee center, and we'll try to build one in Mexico if that helps the problem. But we're no longer going to take the asylum claims at the border because we just don't have the capability. We have a 900,000 person backlog. And when it comes to minor children, we're going to have more than 20 days. The Flores decision is just impractical. And you're enticing a lot of people to bring young children through this dangerous journey, and we need to cut this flow off, invest in Central America if we can, and find a way to fix the situation in a broader fashion. But somebody's got to do something. To my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I don't want this committee to become irrelevant. For 7 weeks, I delayed the markup, working with Senator Durbin. I spoke to Speaker Pelosi and so Lofgren, trying to find a combination of this bill with other things that would do a better job of fixing the problem. I'm not blaming anybody. This has been hard. It's been hard since 2006. My Democratic colleagues have a hard time requiring asylum claims to be made in the home country or Mexico. I know that's a big change in our law, but I think the problem is big and we need to have big solutions. I know you worry about the Flores decision. All I can say is that 20 days is not working. It's just impractical. What did I learn at my border visit? That 52,000 people were released in the Rio Grande Valley area alone because they didn't have the capability to hold the families, so they just release them. I don't want to separate families. I want to adjudicate families, and I don't want to release families unless they win their day. So right now, we're in the worst of all worlds. We can't hold children beyond 20 days, and if you don't want to separate the family, you have to let them all go because we just don't have the capability to hold them. This is a mess, it's a disaster, and it needs to change. And I am sorry we could not reach an agreement over a broader package. I don't want the committee to become irrelevant. I don't want bills like this to go directly to the floor. And for 7 weeks, I've tried the best I know how to find a breakthrough, and I was unable. So I'll blame me if nobody else, but I am not going to stop the process. It is now time for us to move forward and get this bill out of committee. I will continue to talk with anyone and everyone about how to fix the problem in a broader fashion. To my Democratic colleagues, I've tried. I'm sorry. Blame me. But we're not going to stop. We're going to keep trying, and we're going to report this bill out because it will fix the problem in terms of flow. And I've always enjoyed working with you, and we'll keep trying. But I have a motion. I move that the committee vote on the Graham Amendment, MCC 1997-6, as amended, if amended, and that the final passage of S 1494 is amended, if amended, beginning at 11 o'clock today. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman, point of order. Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Breaking the rules of
No,
the committee.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Mr. Chairman, I've been, this is unprecedented. that
No, it's
the chairman
not.
would do this.
Mr. Chairman, you're not going to respond to our request for a point of order clarification?
No, I'm not.
This is how it's going to be. Why not? What rule are you pointing to that allows you to do this?
Kennedy. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Feinstein.
No.
Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy. No. Mr. Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
We'll continue the roll call, and I'll be glad to take any questions you have.
Mr. Durbin. Mr. Whitehouse.
I decline to vote on grounds that this is an illegitimate process.
Thank you.
Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal.
I agree that this breaking the rules really is against the spirit and the issue with me. I'm voting no.
Sass says aye by proxy. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Keep calling the roll, please.
Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker.
Excuse me, I'm here, I haven't voted.
Please vote.
I'm very, I'm more than disappointed, but of course I don't know what is the capital and capital O, and I share the sentiments of my colleagues expressed.
Continue, please.
Mr. Booker. No by proxy. Ms. Harris. No by proxy. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
On this vote, I got the yeas at 12, the nays at 6.
The motion is passed.
Mr. Chairman, are there no
Yeah.
opening remarks permitted for
Please,
this
yes,
side?
ma'am. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, there's a point of order pending before the committee.
I'll leave it up, Senator Feinstein. Do you want me to address the point of order, or do you want to make opening remarks?
I wonder if I could make my opening statement and then
Of course.
we could address the point of order, if that's agreeable. As I mentioned, with move partisan immigration legislation that has no chance of becoming law. Repeatedly, statements have been made that Republicans want a solution, not a political issue. However, what's happening today, I can tell you, will not produce a solution. Today on this agenda, the Secure and Protect Act does not enjoy broad support. And what's worse, it will increase problems at the border. I'm so disappointed that Republicans have chosen to break the committee rules and the Senate rules in order to force the bill through the committee. The Secure and Protect Act was relisted on the committee's agenda last week for the first time. If there had been a quorum to conduct business, this is technical now, but it's important, it would have been subject to being held over. However, there were insufficient senators present to conduct business. For 5 minutes, there were 8 senators present, 7 Republicans and 1 Democrat, and that was after we waited for over 30 minutes. The quorum requirement contained in the Judiciary Committee rules stated that, and I quote, 9 members of the committee, including at least 2 members of the minority, shall constitute a quorum for the purpose of transacting business. The text of this rule is clear. The committee cannot move forward, even for the purpose of holding over a matter until the next business meeting, unless at least 9 members are present, with 2 of the 9 representing the minority. This was not the case last week. There were not enough senators present to reach the committee's quorum requirement and transact business. And the executive summary from last week's meeting clearly stated no action was taken. That's the official statement from last week's meeting. As a result, today is the first time that the committee may take any action on Chairman Graham's bill. The committee rules also state, and I quote, "At the request of any member or by action of the chairman, a bill, matter, or nomination on the agenda of the committee may be held over until the next meeting of the committee or for 1 week whichever occurs later. That's Judiciary Committee Rules 1.3. Democratic members requested that we hold Chairman Graham's bill over until the August recess as required, until after it, as required by our rules. I urged the chairman to honor that request. It was not, and Republicans today are pushing forward with consideration and votes on S 1494. The committee will be breaking and violating its own rules. Why even have rules if they can be broken whenever it's expedient to do so, or whenever it suits the will of the majority or the chairman? Members on either side of the aisle often complained about Senator Reid's decision to go nuclear and change the rules of the Senate on judicial nominations. However, make no mistake, if Republicans go forward with breaking the rules today, this will be a new precedent that will denigrate this committee and the institution of the Senate. I strongly object to proceeding with committee business today. This will be the first time that our committee, and I've been on it for 26 years, will blatantly disregard quorum and holdover rules. It should also be noted, by moving forward today, the majority will be breaking the rules of the Senate. Senate Rule 26.2 states, and I quote, "Each committee shall adopt rules, not inconsistent with the rules of the Senate, governing the procedure of such committee. Any amendment to the rules of a committee shall not take effect until the amendment is published in the congressional record," end quote. Our committee rules do not have a mechanism for modifying or suspending the rules after they have been adopted and published at the beginning of the Congress, nor is there a provision for waiving either Rule 1.3, which grants each member the right to hold a matter over, or Rule 3.1, which establishes our quorum requirements. Again, in my 26 years, I cannot remember a time when the chairman and ranking member did not come together to develop bipartisan rules for the committee that were adopted by unanimous consent. Chairman Grassley and I did that last Congress, and Chairman Graham and I did this Congress. We are proceeding in this matter to force a vote on a partisan immigration bill, even though the chairman did not reach out to try to find a compromise or a solution. In addition, as far as I know, there's been no attempt to publish this partisan change to judiciary rules in the congressional record. Mr. Chairman, we live in a democracy, and our government is only as strong as those in it. Our rules aren't enforced by police action. No one can be arrested for breaking the Senate rules. The rules are based on comity and respect. We're not the House. This is not a body intended to run on power alone, and majority will. However, today, if Republicans move forward in this manner, we will take one more step toward fundamentally altering the Senate and turning this body into a second House of Representatives. If the rules are disregarded, I strongly believe we diminish this institution and this committee. This is not the Senate I joined in 1993. It's not the Senate the framers envisioned in 1787. I also believe it's important to remember this committee and the Senate has a tradition of considering significant immigration legislation in a bipartisan manner. In 2003, then Leader Daschle and Republican Senator Hagel came together and introduced a bipartisan, comprehensive immigration bill, while the House considered a Democratic-only bill. In 2007, Senators Kennedy, Durbin, myself, Kyle, Hatch, Graham, and several others worked long hours to negotiate a bipartisan bill. We worked hand in hand with the Bush administration as Secretaries Chertoff and Gutierrez personally engaged in numbers of meetings. Most recently, in 2013, The Gang of Eight, made up of Senators Graham, Rubio, McCain, Flake, Menendez, Schumer, Durbin, and Bennett, led us in negotiations for another attempt at bipartisan legislation. This bill ultimately passed the Senate by a strong 68-32 vote. Let me say this. Well, before I say that, according to Secretary McAleenan, if the 2013 bill had passed, his comment is, and I quote, "We'd be a lot more secure along the border," end quote. Yet today, the bill on the agenda does not enjoy bipartisan support. No Democrats were consulted. It will not be voted out of committee with any Democratic support. Moreover, if Leader McConnell were to choose to bring it to the Senate floor, I do not believe it could secure 60 votes to open debate. In fact, if Leader McConnell also decided to break even more Senate rules to force the bill out of the Senate, the bill would die in the House. My staff confirmed with Leader Pelosi, Chairman Nadler, and Chairwoman Lofgren, this bill will not move through the House Immigration Subcommittee or the House Judiciary Committee, nor will it come to a vote on the House floor or secure enough votes to be discharged. Let me say that again. No matter how many committee rules or Senate rules are broken, this bill will not become law. I deeply respect you, Mr. Chairman, but given this is a dead-end proposition, it begs the question, why are we doing this? Finally, I want to discuss the problems the Graham bill is intended to address and the policies it includes. We have discussed repeatedly the crisis at the border. To be clear, the crisis is that there are an unprecedented number of children and families coming to the United States seeking legal immigration through asylum claims. This crisis isn't about illegal immigration. It isn't about record numbers of total people trying to enter the United States. I have this on my desk with a little heart over it. This is a father and a young child. This is them trying to cross the river. I'll pass it around because to look at the child sends a loud and clear signal. If I may, Mr. Chairman. We have here it is. We have discussed repeatedly the crisis at the border. To be clear, the crisis is that there are an unprecedented number of children and families coming to the United States seeking legal immigration through asylum claims. The crisis isn't about illegal immigration. It's about record numbers of total people trying to enter our country. It's what is present on the Statue of Liberty. It's what Emma Lazarus wrote. Give me your tired, your poor. And that's the watchword and the moniker of our nation. Now, we have a new problem where children and families are facing violence and persecution in their home countries and are coming to the United States for refuge in record numbers. That's true. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has exacerbated the problems by disrespecting the laws that ensure we treat vulnerable families and children with care and provide basic humanitarian conditions. In fact, in the last year, at least 7 migrant children have died after being held in U.S. custody. In addition, in June of this year, the DHS Inspector General, and I quote, observed immediate risks and egregious violations of detention standards at facilities, including nooses in detainee cells, overly restrictive segregation, inadequate medical care, unreported security incidents, and significant food and safety issues. including moldy bathrooms, unusable toilets, and foul-smelling spoiled food. This is the DHS-OIG entitled Concerns About ICE Detainee Treatment and Care at 4 Detention Facilities, 6/3/19. Then on Tuesday, the ACLU filed another lawsuit because it discovered that the administration has continued to separate children from their parents, even though a federal judge ordered an end to this practice. The lawsuit alleges that over 900 more children have been taken from their parents. With all this as a backdrop, how can we not be concerned? The Graham bill doesn't fix these problems. It'll only make them worse. For example, the Graham bill would eliminate the protections in Flores and limit how long children can be held in unlicensed detention centers. And the bill repeats the provisions in Flores that ensure, the bill repeals the provisions in Flores that ensure government facilities that hold children maintain minimum standards, such as providing clean drinking water and safe and sanitary conditions. Moreover, the Graham bill gives the Department of Homeland Security sole authority to determine what the standards should be for holding children, and makes this policy unreviewable by a court. I question whether such a policy could withstand legal challenge. But even if those were to fail, the Inspector General's report makes a clear case as to why this Congress should not give DHS sole discretion to determine what constitutes sanitary and humane conditions for holding children. Second, the Graham bill would repeal several important provisions that I authored to protect unaccompanied children. Specifically, under current law, unaccompanied children under 18 are required to be transferred from Homeland Security to a state-licensed child care service managed by HHS within 72 hours. That's now 8 U.S. Code, Section 1232. While in those shelters, HHS is tasked with identifying family members or sponsors who can care for the child while he or she goes through a non-adversarial asylum process. This law actually has worked well. Currently, over 95% of children are placed with their families or a sponsor within approximately 45 days. We should be proud of that. However, under the Graham bill, DHS would be given the authority to conduct a new interview process administered by an immigration officer from Customs and Border Protection. Under the new process, the CBP officer would interview a child to determine whether they qualify for asylum. The decision would be made under a new, higher standard of review and would not be reviewable by any court. That's page 8, lines 12 and 13. In addition, the unaccompanied child would be detained and unlikely to have access to counsel or an ability to gather evidence to support their application. Finally, if CBP decides the child is not eligible for asylum, she or he would be subject to immediate deportation. These are significant changes, members, to current law. And what's worse is the impact on children who have no legal representation and cannot be expected to understand complex law. Graham's bill would also limit protections available to another population of vulnerable children. Under current law, children who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by a parent are eligible for a special visa to stay in the United States. This is called the Special Immigrant Juvenile Status Visa, and it's issued only if a state court determines that a child has been mistreated. The Graham bill gives the Secretary of DHS authority to review a family court decision, to determine eligibility, and prohibits review of the Secretary's decision. Specifically, the bill states, and I quote, "No court shall have jurisdiction to review a determination made by the Secretary." I've never heard that before. The bill would also change the eligibility standards for the special immigrant juvenile status visa to make it more difficult for children to qualify for protection by requiring that the child demonstrate that both parents abuse them, not just one. This provision risks the return of children to an abusive or neglectful parent in their country of origin, something existing law sought to prevent. And I'm winding up. I apologize. This is longer than I thought. Finally, the Graham bill would make several changes to restrict asylum law. It would ban anyone from, and I quote, "a country that has a refugee processing center or a country contiguous to such a country," end quote, from applying for asylum. The practical effect of this language would be to prohibit individuals from most Central American countries from applying for asylum. For example, one Honduran woman fled to the United States after witnessing her mother murdered by gang members. She and her sister-in-law agreed to testify in court, but the gangs then also killed her sister-in-law, threw her niece in a dumpster, and threatened to kill this young woman if she did not leave immediately. Under the Graham bill, this young woman would be banned from receiving asylum in the United States. The Graham bill also limits asylum applications by only allowing individuals and families who enter the United States through the ports of entry to apply for asylum. What makes this policy change even more draconian is that currently the administration is blocking women, men, and children who seek to legally apply for asylum from entering U.S. ports. So in effect, this is further closing off legal avenues to apply for asylum. If enacted, the Graham bill would be a setback for children and families seeking asylum for our country's system of providing protection to the persecuted. It would make a bad situation far worse. If the Statue of Liberty could weep, she would. Mr. Chairman, we all agree something needs to be done, but candidly, this is not it. Thank you for your forbearance.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'll call on you just in a second, Senator Durbin, I promise. A little bit about the process and the substance. Yes, sir, absolutely, Senator Lee. Yeah, I'll be quick. So we introduced the bill in May. We have a hearing about will it work or not. They say it will. Senator Durbin asked me to see if we can come up with a compromise. The bill was ready to be held over and marked up for 7 weeks. I've been trying to find a solution. I'm not blaming Senator Durbin. I'm not blaming Pelosi. I'm not blaming anybody and blame me. It's gone nowhere. So let me tell you a little bit about the committee. I'm responding to what you did last week. Last week, you chose not to show up so that I couldn't proceed with the bill that I've been trying to work on for about 2 or 3 months. What am I supposed to do? This is not going to happen. The committee can't be a place where nothing happens because the House may not pass it. We all agree on our side this will fix the problem. We have a right to vote. You don't want the committee to be ignored by the majority leader of either party and just take a bill out of our committee and bring it to the floor because we can't do our business. I'm not changing the rules. I'm making a motion in response to what you did last week. 7 weeks ago, I could have marked this bill up, and at the request of members on your side, I held it to see if we could work it out. I went to the House, knowing that the House has to be on board. I talked to Zoe, who's a very reasonable person. She said, there's no space over here to change the asylum laws, and I really can't go down the Flores route. I said, I respect that, but something's got to give. So what I'm doing today is using Rule 26, where a majority of the committee can deal with situations like this. The rules are still the rules, but the rules only work if we work together in a reasonable fashion. Down the road, and I'm sure y'all will be back in charge, if you have a bill important to you, and you take 7 weeks to try to work with us to find a solution, and we choose not to show up, so you can't proceed, I would expect you to do what I'm doing. Because if you don't, the committee becomes irrelevant. And I don't want it to become irrelevant. The Gang of Eight bill, of which I was a part, wouldn't fix this problem. There's a crisis that's turning into a disaster, and somebody needs to shut off the flow. This shuts off the flow. As to the substance, why are they coming?
The committee meeting, you were talking about 5 Republicans failed to show up too, but in our business meetings, when there wasn't a quorum, we never deemed a quorum to put things over. Let me give you just a little bit of history. I've served on this committee for over 40 years. Half of that time I was either chairman or ranking member. So I think I can say with some authority, the Senate Judiciary Committee is not what it used to be. It's never been perfect. We've had our fair share of disagreements. But even when we've considered controversial legislation, when we've had passionate debate, this committee has always respected the rights of the minority, whichever party was in the minority. It is true that over the last 40 years, this committee has violated a rule when considering judicial nominees. It did it 3 times. This committee ruled 4, protecting the rights of minority to debate. All 3 of those violations were done by a Republican chairman to prematurely terminate debate on controversial judicial nominees. I think those 3 were serious mistakes. But this is a lot worse. This committee, certainly in the 40 years I've been here, has never sunk to a point where the majority is so intent on jamming a partisan bill through the committee, they're willing to disregard any and every rule, as well as even the faintest notion of fairness, and do that in the process. Here's what's happening. If the majority is willing to break any rule in order to report this bill today, there are no rules. If the majority can decide at any given moment to ignore the committee's rules, precedents, and principles, then this committee is nothing but a conveyor belt of ultra-partisan ideas. It's under the thumb and control of Donald Trump. It's a mindless rubber stamp of partisan policies. Now, here's a copy of the rules. And the reason I have the copy of the rules, every single Republican voted for these rules. Every single Democrat voted for these rules. And I hope you can remember, because it was all of 6 months ago. 6 months ago, every single Republican voted for these rules. Every single Democrat voted for them. In fact, I know because they're largely the same rules as when I sat first on this committee 40 years ago. I like to think they mean something. I like to think we could rely on them. But even though every Republican and Democrat voted for them, these rules are on the verge of becoming meaningless. These rules are no longer in effect. The same Republicans who voted for them 6 months ago say, the heck with it. Tear them up. Tear them up. That's what we're doing. Just tear them up. Why? Why are we so eager to discard our norms and principles? Apparently, the answer is for legislation that at its core gives the president what he wants in his political war on immigration. It allows for the indefinite detention of immigrant children. It ratchets up the cruelty against refugees seeking asylum. It's as partisan and short-sighted as it gets. This is supposed to be the Senate Judiciary Committee, not the Donald Trump Committee. And this for a bill, we're doing this We're throwing out all the rules, the same rules that Republicans voted for. We'll throw them all out to pass a bill that's never going to become law. Every one of us knows this bill will never become law. It will never become law because this is not how you get things done around here. And anybody who's been here for any length of time knows that. If you want to pass a bill on a complex, contentious issue like immigration, the blueprint is what we did in 2013. And our chairman in this committee, and our chairman was involved with that. Several others were here. We followed every rule then. We held multiple hearings. We had 5 days of markups. We had 30 hours of debate. A bipartisan majority of senators supported the bill both here in committee and on the Senate floor. Democrats were in the majority. You seem to forget, and I urge us as chairman, we accepted 50 Republican amendments. 50 Republican amendments were accepted. What a difference. If we replicated that same process today, I think we could have a bill that could pass. Now, every one of us agree on certain things. We need a safe and secure border. We all agree there's a humanitarian crisis. Democrats stand ready to work with the Republicans in good faith to solve these issues, as we did when I was chairman, when we accepted 50 of their amendments. And we passed it. We passed it overwhelmingly in the U.S. Senate. It would have become law, and we'd be better off. The Republican speaker at that time said he could not bring it up, even though there were enough votes to pass it in the House, but it would have violated the Dennis Hastert rule, and because of their respect for Dennis Hastert, they couldn't violate that rule. Well, let's work the way we did then. We've shown it can be done. But if we proceed in this partisan fashion, then how can we say the Republicans are dealing in good faith? They're not. We have the model of what good faith means. For anyone who may argue that there's justification and equivalence in this, no, there's not. We're seeing a calculated, steady assault on Senate prerogatives, assault on the practices, and now even on the very rules of this committee, something we have never seen before under either Republican or Democratic control. As chairman of this committee, I never broke a committee rule. It was frustrating sometimes when the minority wanted us to follow the rule, but I always followed it. Since its founding, this body has operated in the principle that civil debate and resolution of competing philosophies require rules. Indeed, a core function of this body's constitutional responsibility is to pass judgment on those who interpret the rule of law. And if we so casually disregard the rules that apply to our own proceedings, it's the height of irony. How do we have judicial nominees come before us and say, are you going to follow the rule of law? They have to be thinking, why should we? You don't. It's winning by any means necessary. And it reveals just how little we care about either the past or I might say the future of this storied committee.
Senator
And
Berman.
someday, I'm just going to have
I'm sorry.
Someday the partisan winds are going to change directions. The shoe will be on the other foot. I would encourage my Republican colleagues to look at what they're gaining by trampling on this committee's rules and precedents. And I would ask them whether this bill, which is written, which we know will never become law, is worth it. And whether jumping through hoops to do what the president tells you to do instead of being an independent senator is worth it. You all know where I stand. I'm going to oppose any efforts to disregard our committee rules here today. This committee still means so much to me. I plan to do what I can to protect the committee I requested to go on the day I became a senator over 40 years ago. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
If I may quickly respond. So here's the way I take what you did last week. You're saying I really can't be chairman. After 7 weeks of holding my own bill. Under this scenario, I can't even pass a bill that I introduce as chairman because two of you won't show up. Now, it would be different if I had not tried. For 7 weeks, I withheld marking up this bill, and I got nowhere. And I'm not going to get anywhere under the current construct until the political system responds differently to what's going on at the border. What you're telling me is that I should ignore what you did to me last week. I will not. I will work with you as long as I can in good faith, but you're not going to take my job away from me. I take this very personally. I've tried my best to find a compromise. Last week, you used the rules, so I could not proceed after delaying for 7 weeks. That's not going to happen as long as I'm chairman. You may not like what we do over here. You can vote no. But this committee is not going to be the dead-end committee on things that matter. We're actually going to act. I hope it's bipartisan, but if it's not, we're going to deal with the nation's problems. I told the Border Patrol agents I'm going to do what I can. And if it doesn't get any votes on the Democratic side in this committee, we'll see if it gets votes on the floor. And maybe it won't. And I'll keep talking to you to try to find a way to bridge the gap. But Senator Leahy, you've been here a long time. I would never have done this to you. If you tried to work with me for 7 weeks on something important to you, and me and my crowd did not show up so you couldn't move forward, I don't think you have much choice. You either give up being chairman or you do what I'm doing. Senator Durbin.
I should just note for the record, I wasn't here last week because a member of my family was being buried that day. So I
Duly
couldn't be
noted,
there.
and I
But
apologize.
I would
but
note that 5 Republicans weren't here. I hope that they weren't at a family funeral, too.
I don't mean to make it personal, but I was told nobody's going to come for the express purpose, so I could not mark this bill up. To you, I'm sorry about your loss. I did not mean it in those terms, but I was informed that nobody's going to show up, and it wasn't because of scheduling problems. So, in the sense of your loss and you couldn't be here, I am sorry. Senator Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, although some of my friends and allies find it hard,
Spoken to me about it.
Mr. Chairman, although some of my friends and allies find it hard to understand, you and I have had more constructive conversations than the opposite.
Yes.
And I believe we've achieved some good things in our time working together, and I believe we can in the future. And when I appealed to you earlier to try to make another effort at a very difficult, intractable problem, I salute you for doing that. I thank you for it. I made a proposal to you of what we could agree to that I thought we could actually pass through the House in hopes that we would have a bipartisan measure that would alleviate, at least temporarily or partially, the crisis that faces us on the border. Unfortunately, we did not reach agreement on that. We had further conversations. In fact, Senator Feinstein and I approached you on the floor of the Senate and asked if we could have you postpone the markup on this bill, and you asked if Senator Schumer could reach out to the president on this matter. We both went to Senator Schumer. He reached out to Acting Secretary McAleenan that same day, and Secretary McAleenan reached out to the White House. It was a good faith effort to comply with your request. And that was the reason why we asked you to at least delay the markup last week, and the reason for the attendance issue on this side of the aisle. I can't imagine that we are going to really benefit this country by moving in the fashion which is suggested today. And I would just say, from the viewpoint of a member of this committee, I can't tell you the pride I took in being appointed to this committee and being asked, even before I was sworn in, by Senator Kennedy to serve on the Immigration Subcommittee. It meant a lot to me as the son of an immigrant and someone who would finally be able to sit with the likes of Senator Kennedy and work on these difficult, challenging, but important issues for our country. And I have always viewed my attendance and my participation in the Judiciary Committee one of the highlights of my Senate career. What you point to is the fact that it is difficult to move things in this committee if they're strictly partisan. The rules are written and accepted by Democrats and Republicans in the committee that we have to go beyond the strictly partisan things and try to work things out between us. Senator Leahy did that with the comprehensive bill that you and I worked so hard together to write. He entertained hundreds of amendments, most of them by our former Attorney General, Senator Sessions, and we said that's the way the rules play out. We have to take the time to consider the amendments, and we did it. It was arduous, it was a pain in the neck, it was monotonous, but we did it, and we played by the rules. And playing by the rules, we brought the matter to the floor and had a strong bipartisan roll call. We were not taking away the chairman's prerogative and his authority. We were respecting it, but deciding we'd play within the rules as had been agreed to by the committee. Now today, we face the reality that these rules, for the first time since I've served on this committee in over 20 years, are going to be cast aside on this legislative matter. I hope that you don't go through with this, and I'll tell you why. I do believe that you can be an outstanding chairman of this committee, that you can lead us through some very difficult times, because I've seen you work on a bipartisan basis. But this is not a bipartisan approach. It is not the best of the committee, and it's not you at your best, and I know you well enough to say that. Let me just say, at this point, we're faced with the following problem. We have rules written that respect the minority in the committee. You have a chance now to respect those rules, and we, I believe, in good faith, must work with you and will work with you to try to come to a conclusion. You acknowledged at the meeting last week that a quorum was not present. Having acknowledged that, no business took place. So today, as we gather in a bipartisan fashion under the rules of the Senate, the rules of the Judiciary Committee, we know that 1.3 gives us the opportunity, any member, to hold over a matter for one calendar week, one legislative week, which of course I would request and others would request on our side. We know further that under Rule 4 of the committee, we entertain amendments, just as we did with Senator Sessions, and many of us have amendments to offer as soon as this matter comes up. That, I think, is a good faith effort to respect the rules and the protection of the minority, something which today you may not need as much as you might need in the future. So I would make a point of order and ask for a ruling of the chair that those two rules, which allow a matter to be held over for a legislative week and to allow members to offer committees, be honored by the chair of the committee, and we be given this opportunity to hold this over, and when we return in September, to go through the orderly amendment process. Perhaps in the meantime, we'll find another way to resolve this.
Well, all due respect, we didn't break the rules. Rule 26 allows a majority of the committee on any given moment to decide how to dispose of business. We did that. A majority of this committee said they wanted to move forward. I've been wanting to move forward for 7 weeks, and we're going to move forward. We're not going to go into the August break without having taken some action on this bill. I hope I made that clear a long time ago. This is a crisis. It's not going to solve itself by us sitting around looking at each other and doing nothing for 2 or 3 months. So the committee invoked Rule 26. A majority of us said, we want to vote on this bill. And we're going to vote on this bill. It's okay to differ. A lot of votes in this committee are along party lines. That's okay. That's why we have 2 different parties. That's why we have the Senate. What we're not going to do is just shut ourselves out. We're not going to become irrelevant. We're not going to give up the committee to the floor.
Mr. Chairman, before you move on, Mr. Chairman, I would like to acknowledge that Rule 26 requires you to publish your proposed rule change in the congressional record, which I don't believe took place.
It's not a rules change, it's a motion.
I appeal the ruling of the chair.
It's a motion, it's not a rules change.
I appeal the ruling of the chair, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'm entitled to a roll call on my appeal of the ruling of the chair.
Okay, be glad to. This is a motion, not a rules change. The question is whether to sustain the ruling of the chair. I ask members to vote aye on our side. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grassley. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sass. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Tillis. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Kennedy. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Feinstein.
No.
Mr. Leahy.
No.
Mr. Durbin.
No.
Mr. Whitehouse.
No.
Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Coons.
No.
Mr. Blumenthal.
No.
Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker.
No by proxy.
Ms. Harris.
No by proxy.
Mr. Chairman,
Aye.
this vote, the yeas are 12, the nays are 10.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Been a lot of talk about the procedural issues we're facing today. I would like to focus my remarks for a moment on the merits of this legislation and on some of the criticisms that have been made earlier today and in recent months about the merits of that legislation. These reforms are at the heart of what many Republicans have been calling for, and for reasons that astound and escape me, are somewhat unique to Republicans right now. The criticism that's often leveled is that these reforms that Republicans are seeking, those dealing with things like the Flores Agreement, reforms to the TVPRA, reforms to our asylum laws themselves and the standards that have been abused by drug cartels in order to engage in human trafficking, that those reforms would somehow undermine humanitarian protections for children and for other vulnerable migrants. Not only is this not true, but it is the opposite of true. It gets the formula exactly backwards. You see, far from protecting children and other vulnerable migrants, the Flores Agreement, the TVPRA, and our asylum laws, the way they're set up without these reforms, exacerbate the problem, and they incentivize further human degradations, the very types of human degradations that we all respond to with a certain degree of shock and horror. For example, it is precisely because of the Flores settlement that we're required to release child migrants after 20 days, and because of the TVPRA, we cannot place most migrant children in expedited removal. These rules in tandem guarantee that if a minor is brought to our border, he or she will be released soon after being apprehended. Worse still, though, if the child arrives with an adult, the adult can exploit the child to his or her benefit. The consequences of this regime are as horrific as they are predictable. These rules and the way they are abused without the necessary reforms that we're proposing end up facilitating truly heinous acts of human trafficking and of smuggling. Children are brought to the border by cartels who know that the U.S. government will essentially complete the trafficking route for them at the end of the road by releasing the child into the interior, in some cases to sponsors who claim to be relatives but are in fact only the final link in the human trafficking chain. The fates of these children are horrible. What they suffer is grotesque. In many cases, we know that these children are sold into sex slavery. In countless cases, we know that these children are being traded, bought, sold, even rented. We have one of many examples that's occurred just in recent weeks and months of a 51-year-old man arriving with an infant child, claiming that child to be his own, only to discover after the fact that the child was not his own. He ended up admitting that he rented this child in order to cross the border illegally, which he had done several years earlier. These smuggling routes are well worn, they are well known, but most importantly, they are built on the backs of our own laws, laws that are crying out in need of reform. We know from past data that nearly one-third of all the women brought through these trafficking chains end up being subject to sexual abuse along the way. And so these are the laws that are encouraging that. We've got to reform them. That's what this bill calls for. So you can say you disagree with the policy, but don't call this a violation of humanitarian concerns. That's exactly what we're trying to solve. Thank you.
It's 11 o'clock on the motion to adopt the Graham Amendment, MCC 199976. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grassley?
Aye.
Mr. Cornyn? Mr. Lee?
Wait.
Can we do this? Mr. Sass? Mr. Hawley? Mr. Tillis?
Aye.
Ms. Ernst? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Kennedy? Aye. Mrs. Blackburn? Aye.
No, and I note my objection to the procedure, which I think is not legitimate.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Mr. Chairman, I vote no, and I vote no on the original vote as well.
So recorded.
Mr. Coons.
No, and Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be recorded as no on the original vote as well, and on vote
Absolutely.
4, I object to this proceeding.
Absolutely.
Mr. Blumenthal.
No.
Ms. Hirono.
I strongly object to this illegitimate vote because you will not allow us to even bring points of order. Mr. Chairman, you cite to Rule 26 for the proposition that the majority can do this with, as you put it, without breaking any rules. I would like you to cite to me in Rule 26, which I'm reading, that says the majority can do this, which it
We're
cannot.
calling the roll, excuse me.
So I vote no.
Mr. Booker.
No,
Ms. Harris.
no.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Vote that yeas are 12 and nays are 10.
The amendment is adopted. On motion to report the Secure Protect Act S 1494, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grassley. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sass. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Tillett. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Kennedy. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Feinstein.
No,
Mr. Leahy. Mr. Durbin.
No.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Without waiving my right to object to the illegitimate and, under the committee's rules, illegal nature of this vote, I will vote no.
So noted.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Without waiving my right to object to the illegal nature of this vote, I vote no.
Mr. Coons.
Mr. Chairman, I vote no.
Mr. Blumenthal.
No.
Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker.
no by proxy,
Ms. Harris.
no by proxy.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
This vote the yeas are 12 and nays are 10.
The bill will be reported favorably for as amended,
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask consent that my statement be made part of the record.
without objection. Senator Whitehouse.
I am sick at heart at what we have done. I hate being here right now. I hate what has just happened here. I think that if the chairman's reading of Rule 26 is given any credence, then it's the rule that eats all other rules. And we are in a majority free-for-all in which no rule, no procedure, no principle, no protocol, and no courtesy matters any longer. That is not in the best interest of the Senate, is not in the best interest of the committee. What frustrates me the most in all of this is that this destruction of the procedures by which this committee operates leads nowhere. We have seen rules broken to jam through judges, but at least you jammed through the judge. We have seen the filibuster rule on the floor broken to jam through tax cuts for billionaires, but at least your billionaires got their tax cuts. After today, you think you're going to get a lot of votes on the floor for this bill?
No,
You think that the House is ever going to take this up?
probably not.
So what's the point? It would be one thing if this were a broken committee on this subject. But the guy next to me stands as a living testament of how much work Democrats are willing to put in to get a bipartisan bill. You, Mr. Chairman, have lived this experience. A very, very wise person who I like quite a lot once said, "I don't see how in the world we solve immigration without bipartisanship." So when it comes to the big things, we're all in it together, Republicans and Democrats. I embrace problem solving. I realize that Democrats have to get something in the negotiation. I am willing to give if they are. I'd like to see that guy back. Just I'd like to see 2009 Donald Trump on climate change back.
We'll keep working on him, but
Graham also said, this wise person who I like, what I have seen in the last couple of years here in the Senate really, really bothers me. We've got to find some way to have a truce here to reset. This is not a truce. This is an exacerbation of partisan hostilities, breaking multiple rules of the committee and breaking a rule of the Senate to get there. Even the most partisan person in the Senate, the leader, said, I think it's long past due for us to sit down on a bipartisan basis and try to fix as much of this problem as we can. Today did not advance that cause. Today set that cause back, and I think today will be a dark day in the history of this committee.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman.
Or just respond to my good friend. I was told that Senator Schumer passed on to the DHS director he would talk to the president if we wouldn't mark up this bill. And I don't know what that's got to do with anything other than I wish they would get in a room. I would be glad to help them, but to Senator Whitehouse,
No.
I'm not just Lindsey Graham anymore, I'm the chairman of the committee. Everybody over here believes this will fix the problem. The people at DHS and the Border Patrol say it will fix the problem. There are more problems that this won't fix. But after 7 weeks of trying and going nowhere, I guess what we're saying is I can't move this bill at all, ever, unless y'all agree to show up. The rules are there to make sure we all talk to each other and work with each other. I have done a lot of talking and a lot of working. The rules are not set up to make sure I can't do my job or you can't do your job as chairman. That's the way they're being used here. I might as well not be chairman because for 7 weeks I've tried to do what you wanted me to do, which I should do, and I'm not blaming Senator Durbin. I went to the House and it was clear to me that there's no market for changing our laws, and it's clear to me if you don't change the laws, this problem only gets worse. This is different than comprehensive immigration reform. So from my point of view, I think I did all I know to do as chairman, as Lindsey Graham, and I will continue to work with you, but we cannot have the committee become irrelevant.
May I make a parliamentary request?
Sure.
The chairman has suggested that denying the majority a quorum, assuming that's what we did, you heard from Senator
That's what I
Leahy
was
that he had
told.
personal business, is some form of aberrant and unprecedented novelty. I would like to ask that your staff and the ranking member's staff report to the committee on how often the committee in its history has been prevented from acting by the failure to produce a quorum. My recollection in my time on this committee is that it happens over and over and over again, not only in this committee, but in others. It is standard operating procedure.
Right.
So for people to suddenly decide that that is an unforgivable sin is also a bizarre novelty, and I think we're just watching a cascade of unfortunate behavior.
You're right. Sometimes we have a hard time getting a quorum because people are busy. But this is not, Senator Klobuchar, I promise you're next. This is not that case. You asked me to lay the markup of the bill almost 2 months ago. I did, and in those 7+ weeks, I've been trying to find a resolution. It was clear to me there was none, and I was told last week that you're not showing up, so I couldn't proceed to the markup. I delayed for 8 weeks. I don't know what to do other than just give up my right as chairman to move my own bill, and I choose not to do that. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my sentiments are reflected in the words of especially Senator Durbin and Senator Whitehouse, because Senator Whitehouse and I were the two members that you and Senator Kennedy and Senator McCain invited to join the group when we were brand new senators to work on the immigration reform bill when President Bush was president. And I remember those times. Well, we were unsuccessful because of pushback, if you remember, which was so sad. It was a moment in time we could have gotten this done, and I don't think we would have been where we are today. And I was proud of the work that you did. And then we fast forward to when President Obama's in, and once again you stood up and worked with us on a bill. Not a perfect bill, but on that bill. And you stood up when the Dreamers, when we were trying to work out that compromise. And my view is we have someone in the White House right now, and I'm not going to go on in my views. I think I've made them very clear in many forums, who has been out there on rhetoric that has been so hurtful to immigrants all across this country, not just people at the border, not just people trying to seek asylum. And I think there are some common sense solutions here, like trying to allow people to seek asylum down in the northern triangle countries, like passing comprehensive immigration reform and using part of that money scored 2013, $158 billion in deficit reduction, which is why Grover Norquist supported that bill back then. And then you can use some of that money for border security and asylum and those things. There is this common sense solution. So I just beg of you to, despite what the rhetoric on all of this. It is just too important right now, and there are too many literal lives at stake for us to mess around with this. So I hope you would reconsider this and work with us going forward.
I will work with you, and Senator Coons is next, but Vice President mentioned last night $750 billion for the Triangle countries. That came through our committee. I was the chairman of the, still am, of the Foreign Ops, and we appropriated $750 billion, $750 million to help the Triangle countries. I'm willing to do more. I thought the Vice President had a good plan, but we got a unique situation where people are using our laws against us. They're advertising all over the world, claim asylum, bring a small child, you stay. That's got to stop. I told Senator Durbin, I got to move this bill. I'll keep working with you, but I got to move it. I got to show people we're going to do something. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am deeply disappointed and upset that we've reached this point today. As some of you know, this is not my first time working for this committee. I was actually a summer law clerk for then-Chairman Biden back in the early 1990s. And I remember watching the ways in which this committee then and over the decades since, and now as I've served on it, has been a place, even in deeply divided, bitter, and partisan times, where folks have been able to work together. Our rules exist for a reason. We adopted them unanimously 6 months ago. They are difficult. They create a framework. They force us to work together. And I'm struck by why we're here, given a point that's been raised several times. Clearly, this bill that's been forced out of this committee in an inappropriate way will not see the light of day, will not see the President's desk. And I am left asking, why are we here? Why are we doing this today? I think it is sadly just the latest step down a destructive path of partisan escalation that we have found ourselves on by actions taken by both parties over several Congresses. But I think as both of you held up the picture of Oscar Martinez Ramirez and his daughter Valeria, we have to be reminded that there is a humanitarian tragedy at our border, and we all should be willing to work together to demonstrate that we support border security, that we support our Customs and Border Patrol, and that we support a humane system that allows for asylum and allows for refugees and does not detain kids and put them in cages for longer periods as a path towards solving this. I don't see how today's actions will move us any further down the field. The 2013 process we followed in this committee was literally my proudest moment and experience in this Senate. And I think I quote you in saying, Mr. Chairman, that you said on the floor after the final markup, after the final vote, that it was a day that made you proud to serve in the Senate. My concern is that we didn't take up or debate a number of points of order raised by members of the minority. We didn't take up and debate amendments. It's not for lack of ideas. We've got amendments that could strengthen this bill. We've got ways that we can deal with these issues. My core concern is that our problem is a counterparty with whom you are eagerly and earnestly trying to negotiate who is utterly unreliable on this. I'll just mention a previous strong bipartisan negotiating effort where on a Tuesday a proposal was accepted and on a Thursday rejected. Without being too pointed, we all went to the floor to take 4 different votes on immigration policy. And an important bipartisan effort that I was blessed to be able to take to the floor with our friend Senator McCain got only 52 votes, despite having 60 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House. A responsible bill that would invest in border security, strengthen immigration judges, deal with the Northern Triangle, a bill that should have passed. We are in a very difficult place. This committee should be the bipartisan place where we hammer out solutions and then help the House and help the executive branch find their way forward, not the place where we further tear into each other and tear each other apart. I hope that we will find our way back towards each other after this break, but frankly, after this breaking of the rules, I think it will be harder, not easier. I will commit to working with any member of this committee, Mr. Chairman, who is willing to reach across the aisle and keep trying to find solutions to what is a genuine crisis at our border.
And I believe you. Senator Blumenthal, should we take a break and vote? I'll come back and listen.
I'm going to be very brief.
I'm short.
Okay,
Mr.
sure.
Chairman, because I agree with the statements made by my colleagues about the rules, and I don't want to dwell on them, except to point out that just to provide a beginning to the research that will be done, hopefully by the committee staff, during the March 2012 business meeting. The committee did not meet the quorum requirement because only one Republican, Senator Grassley, was present. No action was taken, and the items on the agenda were relisted and then held over the following week when the committee had a quorum required by the rules. And Chairman Leahy explained, and he said Republicans boycotted the meeting, but he noted that he had asked Republicans to forego the quorum requirement on days when the committee was meeting only to hold matters over. But Republicans refused to do so, but he respected the rules. I point that out as a historical footnote. And here's the main point. We were together, 2013. I was proud to participate in the deliberations, and the chairman was very much involved in the group of us that produced that bill, overwhelmingly approved by the Senate on a bipartisan basis. And what has changed since then is the poisoning of the rhetoric. And I blame no one on this committee. In fact, I blame no one in this room. I blame the President of the United States. And the President is not the one who has brought us to this point in this committee meeting, but his words have had consequences. And I am hopeful that we will rise above that low point in our national rhetoric and discussion. But in the meantime, the damage done by this kind of action is essentially to raise expectation. A lot of our colleagues will go back and say they've accomplished something through this action. But in fact, as the chairman has acknowledged, it is an effort that is doomed. And so it is these false promises that I regret most deeply. I hope we can continue to work together.
And
Chairman, very briefly.
Yes, ma'am. Just one quick comment, and I know we all got to go vote. The Tuesday-Thursday Trump is a real dilemma. I mean, it's a problem. Talk to the president about asylum and Flores. I'm hoping that Senator Schumer and President Trump can sit down with us and try to come out, money for Central America, modification of our laws, maybe do DACA. There are a million combinations. But for 7 weeks, I've been trying single-handedly, pretty much, to get something forward, and the committee has to be relevant. And I just don't want the committee not to act on something that where all of us agree will fix the problem, and I think we'll fix the problem, and bipartisanship's going to be required eventually, and maybe we can get there. I know that Senator Coons, Senator Blumenthal, all of you have compromised in the past. Senator Roanoke.
Mr. Chairman, the majority has allowed this committee to break Rules 3.1, 1.3, Rule 4, and Rule 26. And since we were not able to offer any amendments to this bill, I just want to point out one of the many egregious provisions of this bill, and that is that this bill creates a law that prohibits administrative decisions to be reviewed by a court. This gives so much power to administrative decision-making that, in a word, it's nuts and probably unconstitutional. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you all. We'll go vote now, and the committee's adjourned.